When Star Wars Ahsoka premiered on Disney Plus, I couldn't wait to watch it. As a fan of the animated series, Clone Wars, and Rebels, I felt prepared to dive into Ahsoka and continue what basically feels like Season 5 of the Rebels series. I've loved Rosario Dawson's live-action version of the character from her first appearance in Season 2 of The Mandalorian to her reappearance in the Boba Fett series. Before I go any further in my comments on the first 2 episodes of Ahsoka, I just want to say that this won't be a blow-by-blow overview of the episodes themselves, but I may have spoilers in it, so be warned. If you haven't watched these shows, I would recommend that you go and watch them before continuing this video. With that said, let's go forward. The most common question by everyone, I feel, is whether Ahsoka is good or bad. Did Dave Filoni, the creator of the character, deliver a good show to Star Wars fans? My answer is yes, for the most part. There are things that I really love about these first 2 episodes. I like the music, the overall look of most of the scenes, the more epic scale of the locations. That's something that I wished more of the shows translated from the Clone Wars. It had some of the most epic vistas and set pieces that I've ever seen. And so I was glad to see that this show had more of that feeling in it. And the fight scenes and action sequences were well done. I like those. And I've slowly adapted to Natasha, the young actress who plays the live action version of Sabine Wren. I also like Baylan and Shin. And you know, it's weird that we have 2 non-Siths and 2 non-Jedis in the show. So everyone's basically not what they should be. I'm wondering if that's a theme there going on in this show. And I also liked seeing the Rebels regulars. Beyond that, it was enjoyable. Like, I watched it 3 times myself. The general consensus on this show is that it was made for fans, that Dave Filoni decided to make a show for fans, which basically means that someone who's a casual Star Wars viewer, it's really up to them to go back and watch any of the recommended animated shows to catch up. If that's the case, and I'm one of those people that don't really have a problem with it, because sometimes it's good to go back and catch up on things that you've missed. So I really don't have a problem with that. But if this show really was made for fans of the original series, then I do have some questions about how the show was handled. And this gets into the area of the things that I have questions about. One of the things that I noticed as a fan of the original Rebel series was the lack of focus on Hera's life. These are characters that I know, these are characters that I love. And while we did get some significant character development for Sabine in the first 2 episodes, and I'll talk about that later, I really wanted to know what was up with Hera. And while we're at it, what was up with Ahsoka? She's the title character, but what has she been up to? Already she's on her mission, and it's a mission that was there from the first moment we saw her and the first live action in the 2nd season of Mandalorian. So what has she been doing? And that's another topic that I will come to later, but I really wanted to know more about Hera's life. She's just as important as Sabine to me as a fan of the original show, and she has a personal beef with Thrawn, as well as wanting to see Ezra found. But yet for me, I felt most of the time she was just a cheerleader for Sabine and Ahsoka getting back together. I know a lot of people talked about the map, the infamous map being an unfortunate callback to The Force Awakens. I would say I agreed with you, and I'm not even going to go into how that map even exists, although I suspect, and I don't know how many people are talking about it, I suspect that Thrawn was aware of this ancient culture, particularly their art, and he knew that the witches from Dathomir also had a long history, and I'm assuming that maybe he knew about these things, and so he was able to come up with something long ago because he's interested in these outer reaches of the galaxy and stuff like that. But that's just my guess. Again, just having this map there that leads to somebody, but the map itself is ancient, and there have been other people that talked about it. How can an ancient map lead to a person who was just taken into another location? And how could Thrawn even prepare for it when he himself didn't expect to be taken to another galaxy? But that's another story. But anyway, that's an unfortunate callback to The Force Awakens, but I feel like there's another callback that I became aware of as I watched the first 2 episodes for the 3rd time, and that's the fact that we keep calling Hera a general. She calls herself a general, everybody else calls herself the general. General, General, General. And if you know, that reminds me of what they did to Leia in the first Force Awakens. To me, she'll always be Princess Leia, but of course, she was so much more. And in the expanded universe, she did a whole host of things, including leading the New Republic. But in the Force Awakens, they just whittled her down to just being General Solo, and she's leading a resistance. But I felt like they were doing the same thing to Hera. They kept saying she's General, General, General. She's also an excellent pilot. She has her own ship. And she's a mother. I had a friend who watched this show, and she's not a Star Wars regular. And I explained that to her, and she immediately perked up. And it's like, well, that would have been interesting to know. And of course, we're interpreting some clips for upcoming shows that we will actually see her son on The Ghost. And that's another thing. Why didn't we see her in The Ghost? I would have loved some of her conversations with Ahsoka to take place on The Ghost, but we didn't get that. Maybe we'll get something later, but you're setting up the series, you're setting up your characters, you need to do it up front. Second thing that I noticed, particularly on the third viewing, is a curious lack of inclusion of the male rebel characters. I mean, except for, Ezra's cameo, holo recording, and references to Thrawn, the male characters in the animated series are curiously absent and not mentioned. Again, when Hera's talking to Ahsoka about her problem and the issue between her and Sabine, it's like, why didn't she reference the trouble that Kanan had trying to train Ezra? Again, if this is for the fans, then it means fans of that series, and it would have been nice to see her at least reference those two characters, but no, she just kind of asked Ahsoka about her time with her master, and of course that gives Ahsoka the moment to reflect on Anakin / Vader. And of course, I know later on we're supposed to have the cameo and stuff with Hayden Christensen coming back. Why is that stuff later? Why not catch us up on Ahsoka now? But again, I'll talk about that a little later. We have Zeb, and we don't see Zeb, but we saw the token, very good rendering of him and transition of him from the animated to live action in that one scene in The Mandalorian the last season. I don't know. Again, I just thought it was curious that they focus exclusively on the female characters, which I like. I like these characters, but they didn't mention at all any of the other characters, again, except for Sabine watching the holo recording of Ezra. The next thing that I had a question about was the mixing of two goals. For those of you who know the Rebel show, then you know that it ended. The climax was with Ezra using the Purgles, these creatures that can naturally travel hyperspace. He's able to communicate with creatures. He was able to communicate with them, and he used them to grab Admiral Thrawn and his ship and take him, what we originally thought and were told were to the uncharted regions of the current galaxy. And so at the end of the show, you have Ahsoka and you have Sabine. They're going to go out and they're going to find Ezra, which made sense because technically you could get to those areas. It takes some time. You have to search, but you can get to those areas. Then comes the show and we find out, oh no, they're actually in another galaxy. So that ending had to be changed, and they really do that. They have the live action version of that scene and they change it up. But the thing is, you now have two things going on. It's not just looking for Ezra, which is what motivates Sabine, but it's also stopping Morgan from rescuing Thrawn, or is it stopping Thrawn from returning? But the only way that you can find Ezra now, because he was taken to another galaxy, is to use the ship that Morgan created. So what are you going to do? Are you going to take it from her and then go to the galaxy where Thrawn is? Or are you going to roll up on him and say, hey, can we hitch a ride? We'll split the gas cost with you. To me, it just seems like you needlessly complicated what could have been a very clear storyline. And that's another thing that I'm going to talk about as I close. I have to say that my last issue was highlighted by a friend of mine who's working with me on a web series. Maybe we'll announce it one of these days. But she's also a writer, but she's not a regular Star Wars viewer. And she really wanted to talk to me after watching the first episode of Ahsoka because she knew I like Star Wars. And so when we talked, one of the first things she said was she didn't get anything about Ahsoka, no kind of backstory and stuff. And before anybody says, well, it's for the fans and you're expected to go back and watch, I say no, because if that's the case, we also, as fans, know about Sabine Wren, but we are given character development and backstory of her. if you were going to choose a character to give us backstory, then why not do the titular character of Ahsoka? And that was my friend's response. As a writer, she's like, did they misname the show? Because it's not, these first two episodes, or this first episode is not about Ahsoka. I know nothing about her. She's just there. What I learned about and where the emotions and the backstory was introduced is when we go to Sabine Wren. And she asked me, said, did they misname the show? Should it have been called Ahsoka? And in my mind, I'm saying, you're right. And it really should have been called Rebels. Ahsoka really needs her own show and her own story. Thrawn was a personal nemesis and villain to the regular crew of the Ghost. That show was about these 5 characters. Ahsoka was a guest star. Yes, it was important. Yes, those are always interesting, but most of the time her episodes revolved around the Inquisitors and also her learning Vader's ID, all leading up to that fateful battle which Ezra saves her from. And with their interactions with Thrawn, it was about the crew of the Ghost. They are the ones that have the personal stake and animosity and feelings about Thrawn. And since this is basically a continuation of that story, it is basically a live action version of season 5 of Rebels. It really should be about them, which makes sense to then focus on Sabine. But that's why I said you should have also let us know what Hera was up to. But if you insisted on this being about Ahsoka, then, as my friend said, we should have caught up with what she was doing and learned a little bit about her. Let the titular character have the character moment growth in the first 2 episodes and not a separate character. But we know what the problem is. And they needed Sabine. She's the youngest one. She's the rebel. The way they introduced her, that was all good. But for me as a fan of it, then I say, why didn't we introduce Hera? Why wasn't she on her own planet with her son? Because her son needs to learn that culture because her father was not a Twilight like the mom is. That's why I said I have questions with the way this show was handled, because essentially it's Rebels, but you've taken the Rebel story, which involved the regular crew of the Ghost, and you've given it to Ahsoka. And that was done when we first see her in that live action appearance in The Mandalorian. And instead of her asking Morgan Elsbeth, I hate that last name, instead of her asking Morgan, where is Grand Moff Gideon, which is what most of us expected, no, she says, where's Grand Admiral Thrawn? Yeah, okay, you have the shocking moment, and those who know, they get it. But what you did in that moment is you took a story that really did not involve her during Rebels, and you've given it to her, and now you're continuing Rebels, but you're calling it Ahsoka. And that's why my friend, who's a writer, a screenwriter, she's like, I don't get it. Did they misname the show? And honestly, yeah, they did. Yeah, those are all the issues and questions that I had, because it's a little muddled, and it, the way they're handling it, they really should have just been honest and just call it Rebels and give Ahsoka a different show. So was the Ahsoka, the first 2 episodes, good? Yeah, like I said, there were a lot of good things in it. Was it perfect? It was far from it. But as a fan of the Rebels TV animated series, I would have preferred they just call this show Rebels instead of Ahsoka. But hey, that's just me.